In this video, we're going to be going through the waterproofing of my easy plywood aquarium build. Welcome back to the Australian Aquarist. But before we do that, I've realised I need to get you up to scratch with how much this build has cost me so far. Just make sure that my wife's not coming. To get to this stage of construction, I've used some framing timber, I've used some batten screws, and I've used some plywood. So the cost of that framing timber, the 90 by 45s, the 140 by 45s, and the 70 by 45s that are in the stud wall behind me, came to a total of $449.20. The 2 sheets of plywood cost me $182.40, and 1 pack of batten screws cost me $19.90. And that comes to a total of $651.50. Righto, so the tools I'm going to use are pretty straightforward. I've got myself my impact driver. I've got my cordless drill with my Maxim pre-drill and countersinking bit for decking boards. Tape, pencil, I'm using 50mm 10 gauge stainless steel decking screws, a couple of 3mm packers, and I'll go through my BoteCote accessories a bit later on after I've actually fixed this timber. So the first thing you've got to do is mark the position of all of the joists that are on the bottom sheet of plywood and the studs that are on the back sheet of plywood. And of course, if you recall, the studs are in line with the joists, which makes marking very easily. Pop 1 screw in position just to hold that back sheet in the right spot, and then go through and just use the drill, pre-drill and countersink bit to produce the holes ready for screwing. I've actually installed that plastic 3mm pack just in that gap between the bottom sheet of plywood and the back sheet of plywood to create that gap. I've done one there and one down this end here as well. I'm going to allow thickened epoxy to actually slide down and fill that gap. And then when I actually install my fillet that will go all the way along, and then the bridging with the fiberglass and the epoxy, it'll all marry together and create a very strong bond. I'm going to be using my favourite marine epoxy, which is BoteCote. BoteCote is produced by Boatcraft Pacific, great little Australian-owned family company. The reason I like to use BoteCote is that it's a thicker epoxy and it's a 2-to-1 ratio epoxy, unlike some other marine epoxies which are a 3-to-1 or even a 5-to-1 epoxy. So that it basically means mixing the epoxy is a lot easier. There's a lot more room for minor error in the mixing rate without it throwing the whole ratio out completely. To make mixing your epoxy very, very easy, you should definitely get yourself some of these plastic mixing containers or mixing cups that have not only the milliliters going down the side there, but all the way around they have the different ratios that you can mix the epoxy up with, and a chart depending on how much you want to actually mix. You can also use this to mix up 2-part polyurethanes also. So that's the beauty of these mixing cups. The first number 5 with the resin and the second number 5 with a hardener. I've now got exactly a 2-to-1 ratio. Fillet or glue filler powder, and that's the powder that you use to thicken the BoteCote epoxy up into form a glue. I'm going to tint all the epoxy black, fiberglass tape. Oh, almost forgot. In regards to cleaning your tools after applying a coat of epoxy, forget about it. You can clean your brushes up with acetone or epoxy thinner. Forget about it. It's a horrible job. You'll go through so much acetone that it's much more cost effective to buy the cheapest paintbrushes you can and a little pack of these micro rollers and just chuck them away after each use. Trust me. Bad for the environment, I know, but you're going to save yourself a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of stress. Now that I've actually pre-drilled and countersunk all the holes for my stainless steel screws, what I want to do is mix up a very small amount of BoteCote epoxy and then syringe some epoxy into each of these holes before I install the screws. And that just makes sure that there's no bare timber, that there's any chance that water can wick down into the plywood. To give it a good mix, make sure you scrape the bottom of the actual container and around the sides to make sure you get a good mixing of the hardener with the actual resin itself. Because it's such a small volume, it's a good idea to let it sit just on the actual bench for about 5 to 10 minutes, and that actually allows the actual chemical reaction to start and the heat to be produced rather than using it immediately. If you've got a larger volume, over 100 mils, which we will have shortly when it comes to actually putting some the first coat of epoxy onto the actual plywood, you won't need to let it sit for quite so long because the larger volume allows it to heat up. Once you get in the BoteCote epoxy a good mix and it's thoroughly combined, the hardener with the resin, you can put in a tiny amount of this black pigment. A lot goes a long way. You only need a couple of drops. Something to keep in mind is that you're trying to build the colour up, just like you're building the coats of epoxy. So you're not trying to slap this stuff on really thick and heavy. You're trying to build it up coat by coat. We're going to do approximately, well, a minimum of 3 coats of BoteCote, but in reality we'll probably be heading more towards 5 coats. Keep in mind, we're not waiting for the epoxy to fully cure and harden between coats. We're going to do that wet on wet method, so the actual process, if you've got plenty of time up your sleeve, the actual process can be done fairly quickly. And you'll often find me out here at the middle of the night putting another coat of epoxy on whilst everyone is asleep in the house. Just saves all that sanding, which is a pretty horrible job. So I'm not going to lie, last night the whiskey got the better of me. I did have full intentions of coming back out and doing another coat of epoxy, but that didn't quite happen. So nonetheless, it gives me an opportunity to remind you that if the epoxy does actually go hard and cures, you do need to give it another sand before you recoat. You know, with that being said, it's actually probably not a bad thing to give this first coat a bit of a sand. The construction pine plywood, it was pretty furry, and so it's probably not a bad thing to knock off those fibres. When you go and do some sanding, or if you have to do some sanding, you can use some of these mesh sanding discs on your orbital, and if you've got a vacuum attachment, make the job nice and tidy and clean. You can also use some wet dry sandpaper and sand it either dry or wet. Fiberglass is the tape or the mat that's used to reinforce all the joins or the corners of your plywood aquarium. But fiberglass, although it's great at bridging gaps and joins, it's not very strong when it's pushed into the actual corners tightly like that. And that's where the concept of creating a fillet comes into play. I'm going to mix up some more BoteCote epoxy and I'm going to thicken it with the filler powder. I'm going to screed that down into this joint. In the past, I've used that thickened BoteCote epoxy almost like a putty to screed into the corner to create the fillet, but I found it a little bit messy. So what I've decided to do instead is to use an actual timber fillet. I'm going to coat the reverse side with BoteCote epoxy, and then I'm going to glue it into the corner with that thickened BoteCote epoxy, and that will actually form the nice fillet that I can then wet down with further epoxy and bed my fiberglass matting into, just like that. Okay, so I've come back outside. It's been about an hour and a half. I've had 2 beers, and when I touch the actual epoxy that I applied, the thickened epoxy, it's just a little bit tacky. It doesn't pull away with my fingerprint, but I can still feel that it's not hard, which means I can now recoat. Wet on wet. This aquarium, as I mentioned, has had 5 coats of epoxy, and you may be able to see that area just there where I've covered over the screw hole with the thickened BoteCote epoxy. You may also be able to see it further along the rear wall of the aquarium. In the base of the aquarium, you can see these divots, which is where the epoxy has sunk down into the screw holes and it's not flush with the top. We've got some lumps where insects have fallen into the actual epoxy, which back in the day, all this kind of thing really used to give me the heebies. It really used to upset me. But you know what I realised? None of it matters. None of it actually matters for my style of aquarium, because the whole base of my aquarium is going to be covered by sand. And the whole back wall of the aquarium is going to be aquascaped with artificial rockwork and epoxied and have sand thrown into it, and it's going to replicate the whole break wall environment of the Gold Coast Seaway. So you're not going to see any of those divots, those insects stuck in the epoxy, any of those thickened areas where are bogged over screw holes. You're not going to see it. However, introduce cooling fan that sounds like a cyclone. Thank you. However, if you are creating a stark, shiny, smooth aquarium that you wish to display freshwater stingrays in, for example, then you might wish to spend extra attention to the finish of your epoxy. So what will that mean for you? That you sand between each coat of epoxy. Don't do the wet on wet method. That way any bugs that have fallen in get a chance to actually get sanded out smooth, and any thickened areas get sanded out smooth also. You may also want to make sure you do it inside an enclosed environment such as this shed, and you may want to install some form of insect repellent system into your shed to make sure you minimize the chance of those bugs falling into the actual epoxy. You may recall that I have set the plywood back by the thickness of the glass plus an allowance for the silicone. Silicone both on this side and on this side of the glass. So in this case, I've set this back by 21 millimeters. I'm using 15 mil glass, 3 mil silicone, 3 mil silicone, 21 millimeters. That, however, has formed a lip. It hasn't formed a recess. So to form a recess, I'm going to use an edge board. In this case, I've got this aluminium, and this aluminium, which I'm going to screw all the way around the actual perimeter of the aquarium, and thus creating the recess that the glass will sit in. The purpose of this edge board is to actually hold the glass in place, because obviously there's a lot of water pressure pushing outwards. It's very hard to get that right with the camera. Anyway, pushing outwards and trying to force that glass away from the base of the aquarium. So the edge board's there for a very important reason. The reason I've chosen this aluminium edge board is that I wanted to try and find the strongest edge board possible, but was also very slim. Now, I could have used steel, but I guess old habits die hard, and I didn't use steel because this is going to be a marine aquarium. But there's no reason why you couldn't use a galvanized steel edge board. I wish to rebate out the reverse side of some hardwood plywood to actually act as a veneer to my stand. So I didn't want to have a big chunky edge board. Other aquariums I've built, such as my turtle aquarium outside and my estuary aquarium, I simply used a decking board. So if you're not too concerned about the enclosing the base of your aquarium with some sort of veneer, or you're happy to have that kind of chunky look, then you can use any sort of edge board, timber or metal that you desire. So far we're sitting over at $600 in material costs for this plywood aquarium build. In the next video I'm going to go through what it's cost me to get to the epoxy and this aluminium edge board stage. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time when we get stuck into the glass and bracing of this easy plywood aquarium. Over and out.